Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this public lecture in the Ambassadorial Lecture Series presented by the Erasmus Plus Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence at the University of South Australia. My name is Anthony Elliott. I'm the Executive Director of the Centre and Dean of External Engagement at UniSA, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all along here this evening for this public lecture by the Ambassador of Ireland to Australia, His Excellency Tim Moore. Just on a housekeeping matter, just to kick off with, could I ask you just at the outset to just check that your mobile devices are switched to silent, please? It can be a bit kind of disarming when these things go off when you're giving these talks, so thanks for your cooperation. We've got a number of distinguished guests joining us here this evening, and the university would like to acknowledge those individuals. So Mrs. Susie Teagan, the Honorary Consul of Austria in South Australia, Ms. Christine Jankus, the Honorary Consul of Lithuania in South Australia, Dr. Eva Peterson, Honorary Consul of Belgium in South Australia, Mr. Steen Jensen, the Honorary Consul of Denmark in South Australia, Mr. Matthew Sorrell, Honorary Consul of Estonia, South Australia, Mr. Andrea Stendado, the Honorary Consul of Italy in SA, and also Elizabeth Day, the Director of DFAT, the South Australian State Office, and Mr. Chris McGowan, Director of Intergovernmental Relations in Department of Premier and Cabinet in the State Government. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, welcome. It's my pleasure to be able to chair tonight's discussion following the Ambassador's lecture when we move to Q&A. In 1967, I think it was, John Ono Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote a song, albeit it wasn't probably one of their most linguistically challenging numbers, that was titled Hello, Goodbye. Tonight we're kind of doing a version of Hello, Goodbye, but with a twist, because we're saying farewell this evening, in effect, to the UniSA's Hawkeye U Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence, because it's the last public event as the centre winds up operations at the end of this month. But I'm pleased to say that thanks to a round of new funding from Brussels, it's hello to the new Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence at UniSA, which is going to start operations here on the 1st of July 2022, and we'll see those operations through out to the end of 2025. And that's with a special remit to focus especially on the digital revolution. The researchers at the centre very focused on developments in artificial intelligence, in increasing automation, robotics, big data, the Internet of Things, Industry 4.0. So there's a lot of debate about the impact of the digital revolution in our lives and our lives in these times. And then alongside all of that, we will still have our public diplomacy program as well. So hopefully we can do many more lectures along the lines of what we're doing here this evening. Well, to welcome tonight's speaker, I'm now going to call on the University of South Australia's Vice Chancellor and President, Professor David Lloyd.
Thank you, na miarna, na marni, na nari David, na harti yuki yaku, na country takin nachi warli, na poitinli naiche, na wagni warna garna miarna, mi pudli naichu kunyan tapathy. So those of you who don't understand Garna when I spoken with the Irish accent, is what I said is, hello, my name is David. I'm not originally from this country, but I am very proud to call it my home, and I do so in the language of the Garna people as a sign of respect. The Garna language is a language which is historically spoken by the Garna people, the people of the Adelaide Plains. For the few of you here who do not speak Garna, my next welcome will be in Irish, Fáilte Rov Galéir, which means you're all very welcome. And if you don't know what's going on at this stage, you probably should leave. You see, when you spend the evening with educators, you do learn something on the way through. You may not know that for the past 2 years, as the world has been turning itself upside down with pandemics and in our case dealing with floods and bushfires as well, His Excellency Tim Mawe has had some of the more challenging gigs than many have had to put up with over that time. Tim carried the roles of Ambassador of Ireland to Australia, but was also the Ambassador Designate of Ireland to the Solomon Islands, the Republics of Fiji and Nauru, and of Papua New Guinea. Tim is here tonight to talk about 5 decades of Ireland's membership of the European Union and all the positive changes that came from that membership, from the implementation of a common agricultural policy to the evolution of a single market and a common currency. And I can say with reasonable certainty that I would not be standing here with the education I have had it not been for Ireland joining the European Union 50 years ago. Equally, he will expand on the challenges that erupted, deindustrialisation, the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, Brexit, and more recently the invasion of Ukraine, to highlight the tip of that particular iceberg. I'm thinking that in the next few years of his assignment, the life in the South Pacific might also offer similar challenges. The Solomon Islands, Nauru, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, all are exotic destinations, particularly for an Irish person, but they're not necessarily sharing the warmest of relations with Australia at the moment. That old saying, "May you live in interesting times," is sometimes attributed to the English. It's often claimed by the Irish, but it's also vehemently denied by the Chinese when it's described to them. They instead offer, "Better to be a dog in times of tranquility than a human in times of chaos," an expression that stems from a 1627 short story, The Story to Awaken the World. Either way, Tim Mawe has some interesting times ahead, and as Australia's University of Enterprise, UniSA will happily lend you a hand whatever you need the road to rise up to meet you. For now, please join me in welcoming His Excellency Tim Mawe on his personal recollections of the past 50 years of Ireland's membership of the European Union. Tim.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. And thanks very much, Vice Chancellor, for the introduction, and you too, Professor, for providing me the opportunity on my first visit to Adelaide to meet you all this evening. And thanks too to you all for coming out tonight. I'm pretty sure you all had other things you could have been doing, but you chose to come here, so thanks very much for that. And at the outset, allow me also too to acknowledge the Kaurna people, traditional custodians of the land upon which we are standing. Irish people have a very strong relationship with the land and with nature, and we respect very much those who have been custodians of this place and whose leaders, past, present and emerging, we contribute to our well-being. What I hope to do this evening is a number of things. Firstly, I want to mark Europe Day, albeit a little bit in arrears. For EU members, the date of the 9th of May is important as a day when a post-war peace process began. And while Ireland was not directly involved and engaged at the outset, it's now abundantly clear that the description of the EU as the most successful peace process in the world has a lot of validity. And its importance as a peace process has been graphically underlined, I think, by events in Ukraine, and we see this every day. Secondly, I want to mark the 50th anniversary of Ireland joining the EEC, or EU, by giving some insights from my own perspective of how Ireland and the EU have interacted since 1972 and even a little beforehand, which is not to say that Ireland hasn't engaged with Europe for centuries past, but let's bring it into the 20th century. And thirdly, I hope to set out for you how Ireland is, of course, a country with which Australia has long and deep connections, at least since 1788, both directly and through the UK. But it's also a dynamic and outward-looking modern European state that, like Australia, is multicultural, globally engaged, and looking to the future. So over the next, 30, 35 minutes or so, I plan to do all of this by basically looking at Ireland and the EU in 5 broad chronological phases. I'll try to marry developments at EU level with their impact in Ireland, to relate them to other issues going on in Ireland at that time, and to also point out where developments in Ireland have contributed to the EU. It hasn't all been one-way traffic. And then to add the personal bit, I'll point out from time to time what I was up to as the developments were unfolding. Not in any Zelig kind of way, but hopefully not Forrest Gump either. Maybe a couple of observations first. I think the period 2021-2022 marks the centenary of Ireland's independence. For our first 50 years, almost exactly 50 years, we focused strongly on emphasising our autonomy, our self-sufficiency and our sovereignty. But during that time, we realised more and more that a small island, economically dependent on its former overseer, could not really prosper on its own. So for the next 50 years, we have sought to manage and to vindicate our independence in a context of our integration into a global rules-based order, and in particular with the necessary sharing of sovereignty implied in membership of the European Union. And I think for the sake of simplicity, I will generally refer to the evolving European structures as the EU, and not get too pedantic about which precise evolution or institution I'm talking about, but if particular bodies are in question, I'll try and be as correct as I can. Before addressing our EU history, I think it might be useful to offer a few basic facts. How big is Ireland? That big, or closer to home, that big. About the same size as Tasmania, but we have 10 times the population. And I think many people who may not know much about Ireland tend to know about the famine which hit us in the mid-19th century. Those events and the subsequent decades of emigration have meant that our population today is less than it was in 1841. In this regard, Ireland is very unusual, if not unique, amongst developed countries. And you can see here in this long, flat dish shape of our population how the trend is. The trend is positive. That starts on the left-hand side in 1841 up to 2021. Last year, in the middle of last year, April of last year, we broke through the 5 million mark for the first time since 1851. But we're still not yet back to 1841. And maybe a brief word too on our economy. In the late 80s, Dr. T.K. Whitaker, who was probably the preeminent civil service figure in modernising Ireland, he lamented that Ireland seemed to be stuck at the wrong end of all the league tables in Europe. And he wasn't wrong, but he wasn't entirely right either. And nevertheless, the 5 decades, the 50 years of EU membership has seen Ireland as a relatively poor country, whom the Industrial Revolution largely bypassed, and which does not have a wealth of tradable natural resources that others have, make their way upwards, up to those league tables, a bit like ink on blotting paper, or God forbid, a COVID rat test. I think at a fundamental level, the provision of jobs is a key requirement of any government and any country. And in 1973, Ireland had just over 1 million people at work. Now, in 2021 or 2022, we have managed to have 2.5 million people at work, another benchmark of progress. And in terms of international trade, you can see exports of goods have grown from 230 million on the left-hand side in 1961 to 165 billion in 2020. And I think more significantly for our purposes this evening, you can see the bifurcation between exports and imports, where the graphs split from around 1991 onwards, around the time of the completion of the European single market. And we get down to brass tacks on a very basic level. This is how the GDP on a per capita basis compares between Australia and Ireland. Going back to the Australian data is older, it goes back to the mid-60s. But you can see Ireland in blue on the bottom, lagging behind Australia pretty much all the way until very recently. And I think you can also see with the little kink or the bump on the right-hand side, the different impact of the GFC on both of our countries. All this is just by way of context, and pretty much everything I say tonight is offered with an understanding that there are very few direct causes and effects in this business, and our situation now and every step along the way is due to a confluence and interplay of many different factors, but I'm only just offering my perspective on it. So to begin the chronology, I'd like to look at the period in and around our decision to join the EEC. From a personal perspective, in 1972, I was in primary school in what I thought then was a big town of 7,000 people at the edge of the Golden Vale. Not quite Bundaberg, but home to one of 4 sugar factories in the country and dependent on the agricultural economy for prosperity. And what do we remember of the referendum? Not a lot. But it was an issue that gripped the population, I remember that much. And the matter was being decided by referendum, by popular referendum. And it was the first referendum in 30 years in the country. So it was a big deal. And if you look at the archives, it shows the intensity of the debate around whether or not to join the EEC or the common market, as was labelled at the time. Much of this is now available online, but at the time it was public meetings and rallies that spread the message for and against, as well as radio and television. And as is often the case in political movements, big painted slogans on walls. And so for many years afterwards, and certainly well into this century, you could make out on this wall, from down the road from my home, the faint and fading outline of "Vote No EEC" that was splattered across in large letters in the 1970s, but it was left sit there for, I don't know, 20 years, 30 years before the weather took care of it. One aspect of being an independent country was that you had to do everything on your own, if you go back to our first 50 years. Sometimes students discover this when they go to college. I recently came across this rather quaint poster, which was issued by the short-lived Empire Marketing Board in the 1920s. And apart from its very direct message, buy Irish Free State bacon or buy Australian sultanas, it is a reminder that at an earlier point in our history, there was Ireland and Australia benefited from aggregated marketing efforts. But post-independence, we were on our own, and in 1960, after almost 4 decades of independence, 74% of Irish exports went to the UK. And this is heavily geared towards primary products, live cattle, meat, and dairy products. And the latest estimate of our exports of goods to the UK is that it accounts for about 8% of our exports. And that trade with the UK was underpinned after a trade war. Circles, things just go round and round. It was underpinned by a free trade area agreement that came into effect in 1966. But even with that in place, it was not a healthy economic relationship between us. And you can easily see how the prospect of new tariff-free export markets to Europe were very appealing to Irish politicians, to Irish business people, and to the Irish public. One implication of that trade dependency was to bind together Ireland and the UK in terms of their EU vocation. It would not have been feasible for Ireland to join the EEC without the UK, because it would have meant the reimposition of all those tariffs and duties by our major export market. Even worse would have been if the UK had joined and we had not, and then we would have been faced with tariffs and duties in both directions. Thankfully, we both joined together. And in the pre-accession debate, that economic argument cut both ways. On the one hand, Ireland would have access to bountiful European markets, or we would be swamped by larger, more competitive European enterprises. And in reality, both arguments were true. And in the early years of our membership, it brought about a pretty radical restructuring of our economy, not always in a good or pleasant or planned way. And maybe to conclude on the accession phase, we should recall that just a few years prior, we had celebrated the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising in a very nationalist way. And we also saw the outbreak of unrest and violence in Northern Ireland. Indeed, 1972, the year of the referendum, is the deadliest year in the Northern Ireland Troubles, with almost 500 people killed and 5,000 people injured. And the question of membership of the EEC, along with the UK, was being asked against that backdrop. But nevertheless, backed by the main political parties, but opposed by the trade unions and by the Labour Party, Ireland voted comprehensively to join the EEC, largely in anticipation of economic benefits. That vote was 83% yes and 16% no. And in a recent poll, the percentage of respondents agreeing that Ireland should remain part of the EU was measured at 88%, which shows remarkable consistency over half a century. So now we move on to phase 2. We've signed up. And having signed up in 1972, on the 1st of January 1973, Ireland, along with the UK and Denmark, entered the EEC enthusiastically, maybe even exuberantly. And in addition to the economic developments, which were notably guaranteed prices for farmers, this is the big carrot, no pun intended, notably guaranteed prices for farmers through the Common Agricultural Policy, as well as capital investment for farmers, the early years of membership saw Ireland rapidly catch up with social protection legislation. The two most notable steps were the introduction of equal pay for women and also the removal of the public service marriage bar. Hitherto, women in public service were compelled to retire when they got married, apart from some professions such as teaching and nursing. Economically, though, things were more mixed. Different location to now, but similar dynamics. At that time, war in the Middle East forced oil prices rapidly upwards, in those days from $3 per barrel to $11 per barrel, at a time, though, when oil generated 50 to 70% of our electricity supply. And just as a side note, it's remarkable in this picture, which I'm pretty sure is in the centre of Dublin, shows how British all the cars are in the picture. I can make out an Austin and a Morris and a Ford, probably made in Dagenham in the UK, and Vauxhall, which some of you might know as Holden. And somewhere in the back on the right, I think you can make out an exotic Renault 4 or maybe a Renault 5 as a token European intervention. If you took a similar picture now, it'd look entirely different, mainly Japanese and Korean, I guess. But as it happened, higher energy costs, intrinsically uncompetitive and undercapitalized firms that weren't on a scale to compete with large European firms, and also a reshoring of production. So Ford and Dunlops and others reshored their production by multinationals because they didn't have to deal with Irish duties and tariffs anymore, led to a huge shakeout of the kind of fairly modest Irish industrial base during the 70s and into the 80s. These were not happy times to be leaving school, let me tell you, and looking for a job. And for many, emigration was the obvious answer. And I reckon there are some people here this evening who came to Australia around that time, or maybe whose parents did. And if you go back to T.K. Whitaker's lament of being at the wrong end of the league tables, there was such a confluence of negative trends that by 1987, an incoming government published the following pretty dismal report card. I think this is the only slide with text on it. GDP, gross domestic product, 64% of the EU average. A national debt of over 225 billion, which is 1.5 times our GNP, and took a third of tax revenue to service. An exchequer borrowing requirement of 10.7%. High interest rates, unemployment at 18.5%, 73,000 of them under 25. Poor employment in agriculture, net emigration of 30,000 each year, which is equivalent to the natural increase in population, and no overall growth in investment. That's the opening page of a government document. That is interesting because it was jointly produced not just by the government, but by the government, trade unions, employers, and the farming bodies, who together sought to turn things around. The stark title was The Programme for National Recovery, which is not very optimistic, and became a template for a number of similar social partnership agreements, later expanded to include the voluntary sector as participants, that underpinned a consensus on reform and development right up until the GFC, maybe 20 years later. And it's also notable that that document, which set out a number of trade-offs, notably tax reform for wage demands, is written very much in a European context. And apart from the EU comparisons made in that litany of sorrows just now, the very first paragraph of the agreement reads, "The programme is based on the fullest participation by Ireland in the international community and in the European community." And its first chapter sets out its commitment to supporting greater European integration, notably the completion of the single market, in return for greater EU commitment to social and economic cohesion. And I think in terms of our engagement with Europe, this is a key decision point or turning point. Having come from a protectionist mindset, which didn't really work, and then having embraced the more free trading approach of the EU, we found that didn't really work either. So perhaps because there was no viable alternative, we doubled down on our EU vocation and collectively adopted this formula of social partnership at home and enhanced EU integration in Brussels as our way forward. And this yielded dividends, slowly at first, but then quite quickly the wheel turned, and the coming decade or so, up until around the millennium, saw rapid progress being made economically and socially. And here's where we come to the next phase, phase 3, which broadly spans the period from late 80s through 2000, and one where we saw the broadening and deepening of the European Union, the establishment of the EU single market, the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, and the acceleration of the Northern Ireland peace process. And where am I at this point? By day, I'm working as a civil servant, initially with our Department of Agriculture, administering an EU-supported investment programme for farms, but also working as a volunteer with various youth organisations that begin to be networked across Europe. So this is kind of the social Europe beginning to emerge. In the day job, better practices and better planning and better discipline was being embraced by the administration, initially as part of the terms and conditions of EU funding, but later as a kind of standard approach to managing the state. And in the voluntary sector, engagement with Europe began to show that our problems were not unique to us, that we could hold our own internationally, and that our responses to policy challenges could be as effective as anybody else's. And away from the economy, and away from the consistent drag of Northern Ireland, and away from the culture wars around divorce and abortion, Ireland began to develop some self-confidence for the first time in a long time. And I don't want to overstate it, definitely don't want to overstate it, or maybe understate it, but the Eurovision Song Contest, held last week, reminds me that in 1992, 1993, 1994, and 1996, Ireland were kings and queens of Europe, or kings and queens of Eurovision at least, by winning it 4 times out of 5. And it kind of meant something. And it gave us Riverdance, which in some ways epitomised a new cultural confidence where smiling was allowed. And in the same period, Ireland qualified for European soccer finals for the first time, beating England, by the way, and qualified for 2 World Cups, including the by now fabled Italia 90 Odyssey. And all of these led to a kind of a nascent and self-reinforcing national feel-good factor, supported by an economy going in the right direction and buttressed by increased mobility and exposure to ideas from Europe and beyond. In this era too, Ireland's EU Commissioner Peter Sutherland, who went on to be the first head of the World Trade Organization, led the dismantling of bilateral air service agreements within Europe that restricted flights and inflated prices. And this Open Skies programme, completed in 1992, allowed Irish people and other EU citizens to move more easily and more cheaply around Europe. Also, as also saw the implementation of the Erasmus programme, which has been a fantastic EU initiative in this broad sector that enables students to take a year or a semester in another country. And over 50,000 Irish students have availed of Erasmus down the years, and over 100,000 overseas students have come into Ireland under Erasmus. And the value of all these programmes and the benefits of enhanced mobility, they're kind of difficult to measure. But undoubtedly, the experiences gained by all those students, all of those Ryanair passengers, and the people that they meet have made a really strong contribution to the progressive outlook that Ireland has today. That programme for national recovery and the model it was predicated on was seen to work. And alongside it, some astute economic decisions around tax led to increased foreign direct investment, especially from the US. And in Northern Ireland, violence abated, with a number of deaths per year being reduced to double figures from 1989 onwards, dipping below 50 in 1994, and ultimately the conclusion of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. All the indicators were going in the right direction, and there was a strong EU dimension underpinning it. And a key moment was the completion of the single market, which allowed for the free movement of goods and the elimination of customs control within the EU. And that image on the right shows the final day of a customs checkpoint in Donegal on the border of Northern Ireland, and we'll come to Brexit later. And alongside this development, there was a significant increase in the EU structural funds available to Ireland. When our Prime Minister, when our Taoiseach returned from an EU summit in Edinburgh in 1992, he came back in triumph because the EU had agreed to provide €8 billion out of a €12 billion capital investment programme. A significant vote of confidence and really fuelled our development. This was also happening against the demise of the Warsaw Pact and ultimately the dissolution of the Soviet Union. A key decision of the EU in this period concerned the reunification of Germany, and Ireland hosted the special meeting of the European Council in 1990, which paved the way for united Germany within the European Union. And this was mirrored 14 years later, when Ireland, again as presidency, hosted a day of welcomes for 10 new Eastern European members of the European Union. And again, by way of an example of an Irish contribution to the European Union, it's worth looking again at the Common Agricultural Policy. This policy, which at its zenith consumed 75% of the EU budget, was conceived in post-World War II Europe that had serious concerns about its ability to feed itself. It was targeted at boosting production and in some ways became a victim of its own success. Ultimately, Europe was producing more food than it knew what to do with, at financial cost, but also at a strong environmental cost. And the fundamental review that orientated the policy away from maximising production and towards protecting rural society and environment was spearheaded by an Irish Commissioner, Ray McSharry. Under his leadership, the CAP began to focus on sustainability and rural society and reconfigured the supports in a manner that reflected the priorities of the time and largely did away with butter mountains and wine lakes and so forth. And around this time, I took leave of absence from my state work to work full-time with the Youth Forum of the European Union. I moved to Brussels and sought to get greater youth involvement in the development cooperation programmes of the European Union and also devised a youth forum policy on rural development. After 2 years, I came back to Dublin to our Department of Environment, where I was involved in overseeing the investment in our water services infrastructure, financed by the aforementioned 8 billion in EU structural funds. And while that was investing in hard infrastructure, two elements distinguished Ireland from other structural fund recipients at that time: our relatively stronger emphasis on education, training and research, and also our effectiveness at working the EU system to get the maximum available benefit. And I think having a good understanding of the EU systems and an established track record for delivery meant that not only did we get our share of the funds, but we were also able to pick up extra allocations when funds came available at short notice. And while all this investment and increased productivity and increased FDI was underway, there were also significant developments underway relating to Northern Ireland. This is a hugely complex subject, but in brief, it was becoming evident even to the belligerents that the long-running political and sectarian violence was not going to have a winner, only losers. People killed, people wounded, families affected, economies sapped, and people choosing to make their futures outside of Northern Ireland. And while this impact was predominantly within Northern Ireland, it affected everyone in the island to a greater degree or less. All through this time, though, there was consistent and close contact between Ireland and the UK within EU circles. Political and administrative figures were meeting in Brussels and elsewhere to talk not about the intractable situation in Northern Ireland, but about employment measures, about agriculture policy, about financial measures, about a single market. And in many of those discussions, Ireland and the UK were of like mind. And this allowed relations to develop at political and official levels to a degree that when a new Prime Minister, Tony Blair, and a new Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, attained office in 1997, there was sufficient trust and shared understanding in the respective systems to get a deal over the line. I accept this is a gross simplification of things, but I raise it because in addition to the involvement of Bill Clinton and the Americans, the steady support of the European Union and the backdrop of EU cooperation were important and perhaps under-recognised pieces of the Good Friday Agreement jigsaw. Now we're coming to phase 4. And as a preview of issues to come, the introduction of the euro in 1999 represented a further shift in our European integration, and perhaps, maybe not intentionally, a decisive step away from the UK. Unlike in 1972, when we were really effectively unable to make a fully independent decision, by the time of the introduction of the euro, we felt strong enough and independent enough to opt in, even without UK participation. And of course, this caused significant complications, but when faced with the choice of the euro area or the sterling area, Ireland chose the euro area. By this time, I was working in IT, and amongst other things, trying to manage the transition of our computer systems to the new currency. And we had a consultant who came in and she tried to minimize her job by saying, well, we're moving from one currency divided into 100 units to another currency divided into 100 units. What's the problem? And then she discovered that some of the older computer files were still denominated in pounds, shillings, and pence from pre-decimalisation. But it all worked out, and Ireland took, I wouldn't say excessive pride, but pride in the efficiency that we made the transition. Ourselves and Finland were on the top of that league table. But then in some ways, kind of a deadly formula of easier access to cheap money as a result of the euro, plus the removal of capital controls and some irrational exuberance, sowed the seeds for later GFC-shaped mistakes. And by this point, it's probably worth pointing out, we were amongst the older members of the European Union, being in longer than Sweden or Austria or Spain or Portugal or Poland. And over the decades, this has thrown up some dilemmas for us. As the EU got bigger and gets bigger, our voice was getting relatively smaller. And it has been a significant challenge to ensure that our national interests are taken into account. Also, as the Union diversifies, with more countries of different backgrounds and priorities, it also gets more difficult to steer the ship in a clear direction. Not long after the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, I arrived in the Department of Foreign Affairs for the first time, starting in our EU division, shortly after the first Nice referendum, and left for Tokyo shortly before the second one. I mention this because the Nice Treaty in 2001, which sought to streamline the way the EU operated and to prepare for an EU of 27 or more, was probably the first time Ireland caused structural difficulties within the European Union. A combination of a poorly communicated treaty, a complacent electorate, and what might now be billed as fake news resulted in the treaty being rejected at a referendum on the back of a low turnout and a lethargic campaign. Cue a lot of harumphing across Europe about ungrateful Ireland, but the fact of the matter was that Ireland had asserted its right to stop a development it did not agree with. And despite some bad feeling and ruffled feathers, a further compromise was reached, and in 2002 Ireland had a second referendum and approved the treaty on a much increased turnout of 50%. Voting in Ireland is not compulsory in any level, unlike this weekend here. And a similar pattern emerged in relation to the Lisbon Treaty, where after a hard-fought campaign in respect of a treaty that also focused on better institutional arrangements, it was rejected by Ireland in 2008. And the reasons were partly to do with loss of identity, where do we belong in this European Union, partly due to a poorly written and over-technical text, and partly due to extraneous issues and exotic interpretations of what the treaty entailed. Again, a similar formula trying to address Ireland's concerns was applied, and when the referendum was rerun, there was a majority in favour. And while the clarifications offered by the EU helped, what really changed between 2008 and 2009 was the GFC, and its particularly forceful impact in Ireland, which caused deep and lasting damage to the economy. I don't propose to revisit that particularly painful period for long, but effectively too many Irish financial institutions borrowed short-term at low rates and lent the money long-term for rapidly inflating house valuations. And when Lehman Brothers, etc., put sand in the Vaseline, many people, companies and institutions were caught offside, as was a government which had developed an unhealthy dependency on property transaction tax to fund itself. Here again, though, the GFC and associated crisis that at one point threatened the continued existence of the euro ultimately stimulated greater EU integration and brought member states and the institutions closer together to tackle fundamental problems. This was not easy, is not perfect, and there have been losers as well as winners. But one thing was evident all through the crisis, and that is a really important role that the EU and the European Central Bank played in ensuring us of the necessary tools to pull through that very difficult time. Not for free and not without political cost, and an argument can be made about fairness and equity. But if Ireland had faced similar difficulties without the structural support of the major economies of the European Union, things would probably have turned out even a whole lot worse. At a personal level, as the GFC unfolded, I was our first ambassador in Riga, in Latvia, and saw firsthand the impact of the credit crunch and associated problems in Latvia in 2008. At that time, I was thinking, and maybe hoping, that to use Warren Buffett's line, when the tide goes out, Ireland would not be found to be swimming naked. Oh well. And as a reward for my time in Riga, I had the honour to spend the subsequent 4 years as finance officer in the Department of Foreign Affairs, striving to minimise the damage of stringent budget cuts across the department. Deep in that crisis, there was for me a straw in the wind, which was the planning for Ireland's EU presidency in 2013. In 2010, at a large meeting of about 200 officials from across all the government departments, the people who would be charged with organising, which is a massive undertaking, the EU presidency, it became clear that for many of them, they saw it as an occasion to do something constructive, to showcase the resilience of the Irish system, and to take pride in Ireland's EU membership. And this was against a backdrop where we all had wage cuts of about 20%. So it kind of showed a certain determination and loyalty to the EU project, which was really heartwarming. We're coming around to home turn now, at the most recent phase of Ireland's engagement with the EU. We're entering the fifth phase of our story. And as we do so, I'm reminded of the Rahm Emanuel cliche, I guess, that we should never waste a good crisis. And I think since the GFC, we've had our pick of crises not to waste. And as we work through our financial problems, we are soon faced with a further crisis in the form of Brexit, a crisis for Ireland, and also a crisis of legitimacy and confidence for the entire EU. And as with the GFC, this crisis once again showed up Ireland's European credentials. If we go back to the discussion about accession and about joining the euro, there was a pretty swift debate in 2016, I'm not even sure there was a debate, over whether Ireland should now follow the UK out of the EU. That proposition got close to zero traction with the public, with politicians or with officials, and with no real hesitation, full diplomatic and political efforts were invested in managing the process of Brexit in a European context. This also meant, and this was difficult I think in some ways, it also meant resisting the temptation to kind of try and broker a side deal with the UK. And instead, Ireland stood foursquare behind the negotiating mandate of the EU. And in turn, when the pressure came on from the UK in relation to the border with Northern Ireland, the EU stood foursquare with us. And just when we thought we could see the light on Brexit, along comes COVID. Not a European crisis, but a global one. And after a shaky start, once again, the ability of the EU member states and the institutions to find a way of working together, working closely together, became evident in terms of testing, of travel, of protecting the economy, and of vaccine development and production. The wisdom of working together soon resurfaced. And it's also a good example of the EU taking an outward and global view of issues of concern, because in addition to tackling the internal impacts of COVID, the EU has been active in the World Health Organization and in its own right in supporting global efforts to tackle the pandemic. This includes the provision of about 50 million vaccine doses to Australia. And it was the Lisbon Treaty, previously mentioned, of 2009 that has allowed the EU to assert itself better in the world, on the world stage, in a political way. And for a country like Ireland, it offers the heft of a bloc of 500 million people and also the structures for an Irish voice to be reflected within the EU position. And I guess prior to arriving in Canberra at the end of last year, I spent a fair amount of time on managing aspects of this process. You left me in the depths of the GFC, and after the EU presidency in 2013, I went to our UN mission in New York, where I spent a lot of time shaping the EU position across the UN agenda. Generally a good experience, but also a lot of work to try and hammer out an internal EU position on particular topics, then trying to bring on board like-minded countries such as Australia before trying to sell the position to the wider UN membership. But there is still room for individual national representation and platforms at the UN. And in that time, Ireland, with Kenya, had the honour and responsibility of chairing the negotiations of the Sustainable Development Goals, which were adopted in 2015. And then when I came back from New York in 2017, I spent the next 4 years contributing to Ireland's approach to Asia Pacific and including the EU, including at EU level on Indo-Pacific. And now again, with the invasion of Ukraine, we see the EU work closely together in a new dimension with new partners. And it's too soon to draw conclusions on Ukraine, but it's already clear that from a common security and defence perspective, there will be significant reflection needed across the EU on how to tackle the emerging geopolitical challenges. It's likely to be a complicated process, and I wouldn't like to hazard a guess at the outcome. But these preceding waves of EU development and of crisis have shown, for me, two things. Generally, the EU will find a way through, and also that Ireland will do its bit as a committed EU member state, and also as a participant in the global community. And where am I in all of this? If you've been paying attention, you will have seen that apart from an 18-month period, I have not worked directly on EU issues, but that wherever I have worked, there's been a strong and increasing European dimension to it. Even now in Australia, I'm trying to ride two horses. I value very much the long and important bilateral relations that Ireland has had and continues to have with Australia. And, and I also value very much the level of cooperation that Australia and the EU has and must have if we are to tackle issues that we both face, whether they're geopolitical, environmental, or the conclusion of an Australia-EU free trade agreement. We have so much in common and we share so many perspectives that it is really important that we collaborate as much as possible. I think it's really difficult to boil down 50 years of experience into 40 minutes of speech. But if I was to draw some conclusions of our EU engagement, they might include the following. By pooling sovereignty with the EU, Ireland has actually managed to assert our sovereignty. By opening up to other cultures and identities, we have come to value our own even more. And by engaging in a broader canvas, we have become more confident in ourselves. Sometimes you have to go outside if you want to breathe. And as the EU has evolved and grown globally, so has Ireland. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And at the same time, you can't outrun the history train. Each of the steps and development I mentioned, and thousands more that I haven't, make up a mosaic that is Ireland's European integration. And sometimes it's hard to make out the picture as you go along. And it's only in the rearview mirror that you can see the pattern emerge. And while I hesitate to use the word history in relation to what is in effect my working life so far, I think now that we've entered the 50th year of membership, we can see the huge progress Ireland has made to get from where we were in 1972 to where we are in 2022. Which I guess brings us full circle and back to the strapline on the video that was showing as you arrived, which declares that Ireland, we are proudly Irish and we are proudly European. Ladies and gentlemen, I have lots more to say, but maybe I'll keep it for another time if you'll have me back. And when I might understand a little bit more about how Australia works and how she might best connect with Europe. For now, thank you very much for listening, and I'd be happy to attempt to answer any questions you might have. Green Roger.
Well, Ambassador, thank you very much for that terrific plotted history of Ireland. We've got time now for questions and comments from the floor, and I'm going to go to that in just one moment. I'm going to ask people to very clearly put your hand up so I can try and get a microphone to you. I wondered if I could just ask you, though, to start with just something about where you, as it were, where you finished up. So in the aftermath of Brexit, and just to, I guess, speculate maybe about the future, if you would, that obviously from one angle, Ireland was really thrust into the limelight as a result of Brexit, because many people pointed out initially, many experts were saying, well, you know, it's the English-speaking country in the EU that suddenly, you know, a lot of economic opportunities are really going to open up as a result of Brexit, and you had all sorts of developments like Barclays Bank relocating to Dublin and so on and so forth. On the other side, if you look at where we are, and consequently, you know, fantastic developments have continued to ensue for Ireland. I mean, I think it's outside of Luxembourg. It's got like the highest level of GDP per head of any country in Europe. So from one angle, things look remarkably rosy. On the other hand, if you think about where things are currently at in the context of Europe and the war in the Ukraine, when you said that Ireland's doing its bit in the EU, I guess this is a question about could it or would it be likely to do more? And I'm thinking this is partly in the context of the sort of Ireland's neutrality, and that issue arises here, because in terms of what's currently happening across the EU, we're all very used to, I think in Australia, hearing the interventions from Germany or hearing of direct interventions from France. Do you see a greater role for Ireland? Is that possible? Is that likely in the coming period, given the transformations that have happened in the aftermath of Brexit?
I think you've come to 6 questions there.
You can pick any bit that you like.
I think fundamentally what's going to happen next is kind of the question. I mean, you have to rewind a little bit. You know, Brexit was not Ireland's idea, and it was visited upon us. A little bit prior, there was a referendum in the UK on Scottish independence. And Ireland said, not our table. Did not seek to influence our referendum in any way whatsoever. Didn't express a view one way or the other. UK sorted it. When Brexit came along, a couple of years later, this is our worry, this is our concern. So Irish politicians and a good number of UK politicians as well, notably John Major, Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern, collectively tried to raise the issue with the UK electorate before the election before the referendum to say, this is not a good idea for Northern Ireland, but did not cut the mustard. Ireland respected the outcome, respected the result, and now we're trying to work to how do we make this work. Did we benefit from Brexit? It's like everything else, there's winners and losers. You know, some guys in sharp suits probably made a packet out of it. But for most people, it's about difficulties with supply chain, difficulties with getting stuff, increased prices, all this kind of stuff, and an awkwardness and a differentiation from the UK that we were not looking for. But like lots of other things that happened all through the 5 decades, okay, something happens, you respond to it, you deal with it, you get on as best you can. So this is where we were going with Brexit. When it comes to Ukraine and defence and neutrality, again, you have to go back a little bit in the history of it. You know, why is Ireland not in NATO? Why did we never join NATO? And then if you think, well, where did we come from? We've come from being part of the UK, who were in NATO, and where things were difficult in Northern Ireland, with maybe British soldiers not necessarily behaving in the best fashion. Why would you join an organisation to go back in with those people? Then it seems to be an article of faith almost. We are neutral, without really understanding what does that mean. Because certainly when surveys are done down the years as to should Ireland remain neutral, yes, by large numbers. But then if you dig a little deeper and say, well, should we have an army capable of supporting our neutrality? Oh no. So there's kind of a discord within the public opinion as to the idea of being neutral and the realities of what it means. So far, so all right. You know, there has not been difficulties or war in Europe, even aside the Balkans, since World War II. So you could have kind of a theological debate about neutrality with no difficulty. Now, with trouble in Ukraine, invasion of Ukraine, that comfort layer is gone. And I think it's too early to say how are we going to respond to that. When I say we do what we can, that's what we're doing what we can. But at a government level where, you know, the European Union, I suppose the European Union comes with a package of sanctions. We're at the front of the class on that. It comes with funding for various elements of the Ukrainian defence. We're there as well, but funding the non-lethal part. Somebody has to fund the non-lethal part, and that's where we put our money. But come on a little bit further and see what happens in 3 months or 6 months. I think there will be a debate in Ireland and every other European country, maybe not as rapid as the one in Finland and Sweden, as to what does this mean. But we're not there yet.
Yeah, and of course, at the moment we are seeing the emergence of some European countries that have long histories of being neutral, seeking to join NATO. Let's open this up to questions and comments. Let's start at the back there, Louis, and then I'll come to you.
Thanks, Peter Draper with the University of Adelaide. It was a great talk, Ambassador. I learnt a lot about Irish history in the EU. Bringing you closer to home, Emmanuel Macron has been re-elected as President of France. He had effectively put a political block on the EU-Australia free trade negotiations. Will those negotiations now resume, and what are the prospects for them?
That's an interpretation. He has been re-elected, but the talks have resumed. I mean, they had the other round of talks in the last couple of months. I wouldn't say they're back on track, but they are on track. They will continue. I don't think France are blocking them in any way whatsoever. And I think they're creeping up on the difficult issues. In all these negotiations, there's a lot of technical work to be done at the start. You kind of agree. And once you hit a difficult issue, you put it to one side. I think we'll be coming up to those pretty soon, and that will determine whether there'll be an agreement or not. I certainly get the sense from the European perspective there is an interest in it. From the Australian perspective, there's an interest in it. The difficulties over AUKUS, etc., I think has been largely swallowed. But the European Union is 20 times the size of Australia population-wise. So there's going to be a challenge for Australia, I think, to hold the attention of the European Union, leaving aside the French issues, to get it done. But Again, ironically, the situation in Ukraine could almost be our friend here, in that suddenly the European Union and others think, hang on, we need to work closer together with our friends, whoever they are, wherever they are. And how do you give expression to that? One way is to an FTA. So I would say, will it be done this year? I couldn't say. Because the negotiation of the free trade agreement isn't for the member states, it's for the European Commission. So as people in Brussels, through their colleagues in Canberra, with people in DFAT in Canberra, are doing the negotiations. Member states come in at the end, when the deal is more or less done, to approve it or not approve it, as the case may be. So we're not yet at that point. So the answer is maybe.
Right. Question here at the front. We're just bringing you a mic. Thank you.
Hi, Ambassador. Thank you very much for coming to Adelaide.
Just bring the mic up.
Thank you very much. I have a loud voice, so thank you very much for coming to Adelaide. So, Fáilte Adelaide. My name is Mark O'Connell. I'm an Irish language cultural teacher here in South Australia and a proud European Union citizen with a multi-European household. If I may, given you're the ambassador, I'd like to ask the question in Irish and then translate to English. Please feel free to answer in English to accommodate the audience here. The question is on Northern Ireland, by the way. So bhí an tánaiste Líamh Radcur RTR maidin agus dúirt sé go tág níonúir de chuige báil ó nócha báil a chuí a bhfuil bhábhar an Northern Ireland Protocol. Agus an tromlach is Sinn Féin, dúirt Boris Johnson ag an talchan go raibh oven-ready Brexit deal ach bháile sé sin ahrú inis. Cé gur bhótáil muintear an riocht aontain ar san. Cad a gaithigh talúnta níos de thuairim anas nach rachaí cadraibh an riocht aontaithe agus éireann níos measa fós. So I'm sure you'll all sigh a sigh of relief now when I say it in English. The Tánaiste Líamh Radcur was on RTE this morning. He clearly said that a majority of 59 of the 90 members of the Northern Ireland Assembly are against the desupply of the Northern Ireland Protocol, meaning they're in favour of its retention, and the majority of those seats being held by Sinn Féin. Which is a monumentous occasion in Northern Ireland politics, considering that Sinn Féin also was close to actually governing in its own right in the south. Boris Johnson went to his election saying he had an oven-ready Brexit deal, but now wants to change that, even though UK voters voted for it. What, in your opinion, and this is probably a difficult question, Ambassador, needs to happen so that the relationship between the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland doesn't further deteriorate?
Thank you.
Yeah, obviously I'm not going to comment on political matters. But clearly, if you go back again to 1998 and the Good Friday Agreement, it's had a rocky enough implementation down the years. It's been on again, off again, on again, off again. But that agreement has always been, or since it's been agreed, has always been at the centre of the situation and the positions between Ireland and the UK. And even post the recent elections where Sinn Féin didn't get a majority, they got 27 seats out of 90, but higher than anybody else, the agreement still sits in the middle. So when the Taoiseach speaks about the Good Friday Agreement, or when Boris Johnson speaks about the Good Friday Agreement, at least they're talking around the same thing. And that process is going to have to take a while to continue. It will continue. It's not going to be immediate. It's not going to be quick. Scales won't fall from eyes so quickly. But the fact that all the parties, whether they're positive or negative or plus or minus, they're still focusing on the central agreement between Ireland and the UK on how to move things forward. And we've got to let them roll it forward and do the best they can. Certainly Ireland's position is clear. The challenge is going to be, will the UK position come on board or not? And again, the EU context is really important in there because all the negotiations of Brexit were not done by Ireland, but were done by the EU and the UK. So if something happens with the protocol, etc., well, then the response is going to come not from Dublin, but from Brussels.
Right. Was there a question there at the back? Did I see a hand there before?
Probably one of my hands.
It was probably your hand. Do you want to ask the question? Given
You
stole the microphone.
You stole my
you
questions, is what I'm going to say. But I'm probably just going to follow up on the Defence Forces question. Obviously, good pictures of the Irish Air Corps up there as well. But I'm just wondering, do you think, like in relation to Irish GDP and the amount of money we put into the Irish Defence Forces at the moment in light of what's happening in Europe, and obviously we do a lot of work with the Finnish battalions in Europe like that. Do you think there'll be an increase in funding to the Irish Defence Forces?
All these future questions, not past questions. Yeah, I mean, currently the Minister for Foreign Affairs is also unusually the Minister for Defence. So I think he sees very much how our defence infrastructure sits in an international context. And for many years, we have taken great pride in our engagement, particularly in UN peacekeeping operations. In some ways, a lot of the training, a lot of the action of the defence forces come through UN headings. And since we did our first peacekeeping operation in 1959, I think it was, we have had Irish soldiers on duty for the UN every single day. And I think we're the only country in the UN who can achieve that. And we're achieving that against a backdrop of not very large defence forces. And in the recent couple of months, a new report has come out, commissioned by the Department of Defence, on what is needed for the defence forces. And it says we need, I think, about 3,000 more, I wouldn't say men, but men and women in the defence forces. How quickly this can be done, I don't know. Whether Ukraine will accelerate it or not, you'd have to assume yes, but that's an assumption. But clearly, that general debate as in where do we go in terms of defence is going to have an impact on what resources can be provided, will be provided to the defence forces in the time to come.
Question at the back there, gentlemen. Thank you.
Slightly different approach in terms of the relationship with Britain and Europe. For the last 25 years, Ireland and Britain have nearly lined up to prevent social legislation in a number of areas. For example, the European Information Consultation Directive, the redraft of the Works Council Directive and the like, and using the qualified majority voting strength, along with the likes of Hungary and Poland, have blocked a number of social legislation pieces. Without Britain gone, where does that leave Ireland? Does it leave them lining up alongside Orban, or will it be a case of Ireland? Do you think Ireland will redirect its attention in terms of becoming more aligned with a greater social Europe with the exit of Britain in that way?
I mean, that's put that in a very broader, or in a broader context, which is with the UK gone, whereas Ireland within the European Union. I mean, it'd be really good if we had big, massive magnets and we could invert the islands so that we're right next to mainland Europe, but that's unlikely to happen in the coming few years. And it is a problem for us, I have to say. It's an issue for us to how do we engage, but it's one that we are solving every day because there are new alliances needed with different elements of the European Union. One thing down the years Ireland has always been very careful about is not being in a camp. We have relationships with all the different European member states in different contexts. There was a period at one point where there was a lot of pressure to set up kind of a small states group within the European Union. And Ireland kind of stood back from it a little bit, saying we don't want to be labelled as being one thing or the other. So when it comes to the economic planning or the social models, again, Ireland will do what it can according to what we want to achieve and work with whoever across the European Union will support us while retaining our values. So you mentioned one or two countries there with whom we would have difficulties in other areas. But this is the nature of being part of the European Union. There's a huge matrix of relationships, and you've got to manage them all as best you can according to your needs.
Right, well, we're almost out of time. Was there anyone that had a very quick question that didn't get it? Yes, right. Thank you very much. So Mike's just coming to you now. Thanks.
Ambassador, thank you very much for a very interesting talk tonight. My question is a simple one. What most excites you economically, socially, politically in current Ireland, please?
Excites? Don't do excitement much. You know? What pleases me, I suppose, and I see it time and time again, is that notwithstanding the different challenges we have had down the decades, there is still really strong social cohesion in Ireland. So when we're faced with something heavy, whatever it is, whether it is Brexit, or currently we have 30,000 Ukrainians have landed in, sort of a medium-sized town full of people have landed in the country, the response isn't just from 3 guys in Dublin or 20 people in Dublin. The whole population can get behind something. And this is something that not every European country has, I don't think. Now, every country thinks they're special, but I think an Irish society, even though it is now different to what it was in 1972 or even 2002, that sense of social, shared purpose and social cohesion is still carrying through. And I hope it does continue. And then I'd be excited.
Okay, so at that point, we are out of time. Ambassador, I'd like to thank you very much for your reflections this evening. We would indeed be delighted to have you come back and talk to us in the future. And we look forward to, with the new centre, being able to issue an invitation. I might also note that, because I've got some colleagues here in the room, our centre's winding up, but we do have this Jean Monnet network, and some of us are just about to head off to Europe, and we're running an event in Dublin. It takes us straight to UCD, so we're hopefully doing our bit at continuing the Australia, EU, and in particular the Irish relations. But I would like to thank you very much, Tim, for coming and joining us here at the university, and thank you for your lecture. Thank you.